I was called to the beach just before sunrise, when Miami looks briefly honest. The tide was low, pulling itself away from the shore like it wanted no part of what had been left behind. A uniform stood near the waterline, pale, not taking notes, not speaking, just staring. That's how I knew the body was wrong before I even saw it. He was face down at first. Waves nudged him gently, almost respectfully. When we rolled him over, the light caught the colors all at once. White linen suit, pastel shirt, the kind of outfit people wore when they thought the future would last forever. It wasn't a costume. The fabric was old, authentically old, softened by decades of use that shouldn't have existed. The shoes had salt stains from a different era. The man's name was Carlos Mendes. The coroner would later say he'd been dead for 6 hours. My eyes said something else entirely. His skin was yellowed, cracked, stretched tight in places and sagging in others, like it had been learning how to decay since Reagan was president. It wasn't rot. It was imitation. Careful, deliberate, loving. Beachgoers gathered at a distance, phones out, whispering. To them, it was just another body in a city that eats its own. But standing there, ankle deep in cold water, I felt a pressure behind my eyes, like the moment before a migraine. The ocean smelled wrong. The air felt recycled. As the sun broke the horizon, I had the sudden, irrational certainty that this wasn't a discovery. It was a reenactment. The autopsy room was too cold, even for Miami. Fluorescent lights flattened everything, turning skin into something artificial, like wax left too close to heat. Carlos Mendes lay on the table, zipped open, his chest marked and measured, reduced to data. According to the clock on the wall, he'd been dead for 6 hours. According to the paperwork, the tide, the temperature, the insect activity, everything agreed. The body didn't. Up close, the skin told a different story. Not decomposition, not disease. It was treated. Pigments embedded deep into the pores, microfractures where elasticity should have been. His flesh had been altered to resemble something far older than the man himself, like someone had followed a reference photo from a year that refused to stay buried. The coroner said it was cosmetic, theatrical. I watched his hands shake when he said it. There were no defensive wounds, no hesitation marks, just a single, clean incision along the ribs, already darkened from the inside out. Whatever cut him had vanished completely, leaving behind only a chemical echo. Toxicology flagged cocaine in concentrations that made no sense, too pure, too bound, as if it had been engineered to become part of him. I stared at the date on the report, too, then at the body. Every instinct I had told me the same thing. This man did not belong to this year. I left the morgue with the taste of metal in my mouth and drove until the streets started repeating themselves. Miami has a talent for distraction. Neon, music, glass, constant motion. But once you notice the pattern, it's hard to unsee. The same billboard, the same palm leaning at the same angle. Like the city was stuck on a frame it refused to advance past. I returned to the beach alone. The body was gone. The sand raked smooth. No sign that anything had happened. Tourists walked where Carlos Mendes had died, laughing, stepping over the exact spot without knowing it had already been used once before. That was the first lie, that the city forgets. Miami doesn't forget. It overwrites. I pulled old case photos from 1985 on my phone. Standing ankle-deep in the surf. The alignment was perfect. Same access path, same angle of the sun, same stretch of water. The past hadn't inspired the present. It had been scheduled. A headache bloomed behind my eyes, sharp and rhythmic, like something tapping from the inside. I had the unsettling feeling of being observed by the buildings themselves, as if the concrete remembered me. The wind carried a siren that wasn't coming from anywhere nearby. That was when I understood the second lie. This city wasn't alive. It was preserved. The evidence locker was quiet in the way hospitals are quiet, nothing moving, but nothing resting either. I stood over the sealed bag that should have held a weapon. It didn't, just a smear on the inside of plastic and a label that felt like a lie when I read it back to myself. No blade recovered. Forensics walked me through it twice. No metal fragments, no fibers, no handle impression in the wound. The incision was too clean to be blunt force, too precise to be improvised. Whatever cut Carlos Mendes had entered his body and then stopped being a thing you could hold. Blood samples told the rest of the story. Cocaine, but not street cocaine. This was dense, refined, chemically stabilized into a structure that shouldn't have been possible. The substance had behaved like steel for a fraction of a second, then melted, dispersing straight into the bloodstream. A wound and an overdose in the same motion. A weapon designed to erase itself. I watched the tech replay the data on a monitor, lines spiking where they shouldn't, numbers contradicting each other. He kept saying the same word under his breath, impossible, like repetition might soften it. Walking out. I realized what unsettled me most wasn't the ingenuity. It was the intent. Whoever built this didn't want credit, didn't want proof. They wanted the act to survive without the object. A murder that could never be held, only absorbed. Toxicology took longer than it should have. Not because the lab was slow, but because the results kept refusing to settle into a single explanation. Carlos Mendes didn't die from blood loss. He didn't die from shock. He didn't even die from a conventional overdose. He died because his body accepted something it was never meant to carry. The substance had entered through the incision and spread with intention, binding to tissue, hitching rides through veins like it understood circulation better than we did. Organs showed damage in a sequence that felt rehearsed. Heart first, then lungs, then the brain, drowning in its own overstimulation while the rest of him was still technically alive. The coroner tried to joke about it, called it weaponized cocaine, then stopped laughing when the numbers came back higher the second time. The drug hadn't diluted, it had integrated, as if the blade hadn't just cut Carlos, but rewritten him on a chemical level. I kept thinking about absorption, about how some poisons don't kill immediately. They wait. Let the body help them. This wasn't an attack. It was cooperation forced at a molecular scale. By the time his nervous system collapsed, there was nothing left to fight, no foreign object to remove, no antidote to flush. The weapon had become indistinguishable from the victim. I closed the report knowing one thing for certain. Whatever was coming next would leave nothing behind to pull out. By the third briefing, no one was asking how to catch the killer anymore. The questions had shifted. How do you document something that refuses to exist? How do you prove a weapon that leaves no shadow, no weight, no aftermath you can point to in a courtroom? I spread the photos across my desk and saw the design in it. Not just the blade, but the method. The crime scene washed clean by the tide, the weapon dissolving into the bloodstream. The cause of death splintered across categories until it belonged to none of them. Every part of the act was engineered to deny permanence. This wasn't rage, it wasn't desperation, it was discipline. Someone had planned a murder that would survive only as an event, never as evidence. A crime that could be described, but never reconstructed. Even memory felt unreliable, like the details would soften if I didn't keep writing them down. I imagined the blade in motion, solid for a heartbeat, then gone. No trophy, no proof of skill, just the certainty that the act had occurred. That was the point. to make violence behave like time itself, always moving forward. Impossible to grasp once it passes. I realized then that the killer wasn't hiding. They were subtracting, and if they could erase the weapon, they could erase anything else that got in the way. The archive room smelled like dust and old toner, the kind of place time goes to wait. I hadn't planned on digging into the 80s, but the beach coordinates kept circling back in my head, refusing to stay random. Dates blurred together until 1 month stood out like a bruise. October 85. I pulled the first box and felt the weight of it immediately. Inside were photos curled at the edges, typed reports yellowed by decades of neglect. The victim's position stopped me cold. Same shoreline, same angle of the body. Even the tide notes matched within minutes. I checked another file, then another. It wasn't coincidence, it was alignment. Each case had stalled the same way. No suspect, no weapon, no motive strong enough to survive review. The language was cautious, apologetic, like the detectives back then knew they were missing something, but didn't have the vocabulary to name it. I laid the photos side by side with the images from Carlos Mendy's scene. The resemblance was surgical. It felt less like I was comparing crimes, and more like I was watching a negative being developed again. Decades later. Cold cases aren't dead, they're unfinished, and something had decided it was time to continue. I took the files home with me, spread them across my kitchen table like tarot cards. Beach access points, distances from the lifeguard towers, angles measured from fixed landmarks that technically no longer existed. When I overlaid the maps digitally, the lines locked into place so cleanly it made my stomach turn. These weren't similar crimes. They were duplicates. Every victim from 1980 had a modern counterpart. Same height range, same build, same subtle markers, old fractures, dental work, scars that matched like photocopies. It was as if the city had reached backward, selected templates, and printed them again with newer ink. The positioning was exact, arms angled the same way, heads turned toward the same stretch of water. Even the timing followed the same rhythm. Early morning. Low tide. Just before the city woke up enough to pretend nothing happened. I started marking the deaths on a calendar. The intervals lined up with surgical precision. Not random, not impulsive. Rehearsed across decades. That was when the thought landed. Heavy and unwelcome. Someone wasn't killing people. They were recreating deaths that had already occurred. Correcting them. Like a record, skipping back to the same groove and playing it again until it sounded right. I stopped trusting dates after that. The more I stared at the timeline, the less it behaved like something moving forward. October 1985 bled into the present, not as memory, but as instruction. The calendar on my wall felt decorative, a suggestion rather than a rule. I returned to the beach at the exact minute one of the old reports listed, standing where a man had died nearly 40 years ago. The light matched the photograph. The shadows fell the same way. Even the wind came off the water at the same angle, carrying that familiar, sour smell of salt and decay. I checked my watch twice, convinced it was lying to me. Pedestrians passed through the space without noticing it was occupied twice over. I felt layered there, like I was standing in two moments at once. The headache came back, sharper this time, pulsing in time with the surf. That was when it hit me. Time wasn't repeating itself. It was following instructions written long ago, executing them without understanding why. The murders weren't echoes. They were scheduled events, waiting patiently for the calendar to catch up. Whatever was happening didn't care what year it was. The date was just another prop. The wallets came last, as if the city wanted me tired before showing its hand. Each victim carried one, neatly placed. Never stolen. Inside were driver's licenses, membership cards, hotel keys, ordinary debris of a life interrupted. Except none of it belonged in this century. I held Carlos Mendes' license under the desk lamp and felt something tighten in my chest. Issued in 1984. Lamination yellowed at the edges. The photo grainy in a way modern printers can't fake. Even the address existed only on zoning maps that had been obsolete before I'd learned to read. Receipts told the same story. Parking stubs, bar tabs, cash register ink faded unevenly. Letters bleeding into paper fibers the way they only do with time. Not wear, not distressing. Aging. Natural. Patient. Unforgiving. I sent the items to 3 different labs, expecting the same answer dressed in different language. Instead, they agreed on the part that mattered most. The materials were real. The degradation was consistent. These objects had been moving forward through decades like everything else, which made the question unavoidable if the documents were truly that old. Then someone had been living these lives long before the bodies appeared. Or worse, these lives had already ended once and were now being issued again. Paper doesn't lie. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to teach it how. The lab reports came back one by one, each of them closing a door I wanted left open. Ink composition matched formulations, discontinued in the late 80s. Paper fibers showed oxidation patterns that only form after decades of exposure to air. Even the adhesive on the laminates had broken down in the slow, uneven way that can't be rushed without leaving scars. Forgery was ruled out quietly, almost politely. No one wanted to say the alternative out loud. I visited one of the analysts in person, hoping proximity would make the truth negotiable. He showed me the samples under magnification, pointed out the microfractures, the natural inconsistencies no modern process could replicate. These weren't made to look old, he said. They just are. That was the moment the case stopped feeling criminal and started feeling archaeological. These documents hadn't been planted. They'd been carried, renewed, aged in pockets, wallets, glove compartments, lived with, which meant the victims weren't just mirrors of the past. They were continuations. I thought about Carlos walking into bars that no longer existed, parking in lots paved over years ago, presenting identification to people who should be retired or dead. The city must have accepted it. Miami always does. Authenticity, I realized, doesn't require explanation. It only requires time to cooperate. I started looking at the victims' faces differently after that, searching for seams, something that would tell me they weren't entirely here. But in photos, in records, in the brief digital footprints they'd left behind, they behaved like real people. They paid rent. They argued with neighbors. They complained online about traffic and heat. No gaps, no glitches. And yet, when I compared them to the 1985 files, the similarities were unbearable. Bone structure, eye spacing, even expressions frozen mid-surprise in crime scene photos matched across decades. It wasn't genetic coincidence. It was repetition. I wondered if they knew, if Carlos had ever felt out of step, like his reflection lagged half a second behind, if he'd carried memories that didn't quite belong to him, places he'd never been that felt worn and familiar. The word reincarnation felt lazy, too spiritual. This was mechanical. Echoes imply distance, a fading. These people weren't fading. They were being reissued. That thought followed me home, settled into the corners of my apartment. If the victims were echoes given flesh, then the city wasn't just remembering the past. It was reusing it, and I couldn't shake the fear that repetition doesn't stop on its own. It waits its turn. The phone rang while I was asleep, vibrating against the nightstand like something trying to burrow its way out. No ringtone, no caller ID, just the raw insistence of motion. I didn't recognize the device at first. It wasn't my personal phone, or my work one. It was a burner. Matte black, unmarked, the kind we logged into evidence, not the kind we carried home. I knew immediately it hadn't been issued to me. The call connected the second I picked it up. No greeting, no static, just a breath. Measured and close, like the caller was standing just behind the line. I asked how they got this number. The question felt stupid as soon as I said it. "You've always had it," the voice replied. Filtered, flattened, stripped of anything that could anchor it to a person. Not male or female, not young or old. It spoke like it was reading something already written. They referenced details from the case I hadn't filed yet, locations I hadn't revisited, conclusions I hadn't reached. Each sentence landed half a second before my own thoughts caught up. When the call ended, the phone powered itself down. No record, no missed call, no serial number under the battery. I stood there in the dark, holding an object that had appeared without permission, with the sinking realization that someone wasn't contacting me from outside the investigation. They were calling from somewhere it hadn't finished yet. The phone rang again the next night. Same vibration, same sudden certainty that ignoring it would be a mistake. The voice didn't bother with pretense this time. It spoke in statements, not explanations, as if clarification had already failed in other versions of this conversation. "Miami Beach isn't a city," it said. "It's an injury." They described the 80s not as a decade, but as a pressure point. Cocaine money, speed, violence, too much force applied too quickly. Time, the voice claimed, had torn there, folding back on itself like skin that never healed properly. The city kept reopening the same moment, unable to scar over. I argued, "Cities don't bleed, years don't overlap." The voice let me finish, then continued like I hadn't spoken. "That's why the documents age. That's why the bodies repeat. You're standing in a place where past and present occupy the same tissue." As they spoke, I felt it, a dull ache behind my eyes, identical to the one I'd had on the beach. The headache wasn't stress, it was proximity. Before the line went dead, the voice left me with one last certainty. "Every wound wants to close," it said, "but some can only do it by consuming what's around them." The call ended. Miami outside my window looked unchanged, glowing and alive. I wondered how much blood a city could lose before anyone admitted it was hurt. The voice waited until the third call to tell me the number. 6. It said it the way you say a rule you didn't invent, but have been enforcing for a long time. Not with reverence, with maintenance. In 1985, according to the voice, a group of men noticed the wound before anyone else did. They were dealers, fixers, architects of excess. They believed Miami had peaked, that the moment was too perfect to be allowed to pass. So they designed a loop, not a machine, not a spell, something procedural. 6 deaths, arranged with care, to anchor the city to that era whenever time tried to move on. The ritual wasn't about sacrifice, it was about balance. 6 lives to stabilize the overlap, 6 bodies to remind the wound where its edges were. When the city drifted too far from itself, the cycle restarted. I asked why 6. "Because fewer isn't enough," the voice said, "and more causes collapse." The murders weren't escalating, they were counting down. When the call ended, I sat in the dark, replaying the cases in my head, numbering them without meaning to. A cold realization settled in, slow and absolute. 5 had already happened. Whatever the ritual was meant to preserve, it was nearly complete. And I had the terrible sense that the final roll hadn't been cast at random. The file wasn't where it should have been. It was misdated, misfiled, buried in a box labeled Miscellaneous, 1985, like someone had hoped it would dissolve into noise if left alone long enough. The report was thin, too thin. No name, no prints, no photographs clear enough to be useful. Just a body pulled from the water on October 31st, listed as male, approximate age unknown. What caught my attention was the language. The coroner's notes were careful to the point of anxiety. Facial damage inconsistent with the environment. Identification compromised beyond recovery. Personal effects missing. Not stolen. Removed. As if the body had been edited. The location matched the others. Same stretch of beach, same tide window, same early morning discovery. I traced the date with my finger, feeling a dull pressure build behind my eyes. Halloween. The officer who'd signed off on the report was long retired, possibly dead. There were no follow-ups, no unresolved questions, because no one had known which ones to ask yet. I stared at the grainy image clipped to the back of the file. The face was gone, but the body shape was familiar in a way that made my pulse stutter. The height, the shoulders, the posture, even in death. I told myself it was coincidence. The file didn't argue. It just waited, patient and silent, like it already knew I would come looking. I didn't want to run the comparison myself. That felt like inviting something across a line. So I submitted the request under a different case number, stripped of context, framed as routine. Just teeth, just Ickerts. Data doesn't care about superstition. The weight was unbearable anyway. Dental charts are intimate in a way faces aren't. They record every fracture, every careless bite, every repair made to keep going. When the results came back, they didn't arrive with drama. No alarms, no hesitation. Just a match percentage so high it collapsed into certainty. 100%. The unidentified body from 1985 shared my dental history down to the smallest detail. A chipped molar from a childhood accident I barely remembered. A filling I'd gotten during my first year on the force, after too much coffee and not enough sleep. Procedures that hadn't existed in the 80s, recorded on a body that had died there anyway. I stared at the screen until the words lost meaning. There was no margin for error. Teeth don't lie. They don't drift through time. They stay exactly where they're put. Someone had died in 1980 with my mouth. I felt the room tilt, like gravity had been recalibrated without warning. If the records were true, and they were, then I wasn't just approaching the end of the ritual. I'd already reached it once. And somehow, impossibly, I was standing here again, reading proof that I had already failed to escape myself. I kept my badge on the desk that night, face up, like it was watching me. The weight of it felt different once I knew. Not heavier, older, as if it had already been issued once before and simply found its way back to me. I replayed my career in reverse, searching for divergence. Every promotion, every transfer, every case that nudged me closer to the beach without ever saying why. I'd thought of it as momentum, luck, aptitude. Now it looked more like routing, a path designed to deliver me to a specific coordinate at a specific time. The badge wasn't proof of protection. It was proof of assignment. I realized then why the unidentified body had been left faceless, why the file was thin, why no one in 1980 had pushed harder for answers. The system had encountered something it couldn't process, so it labeled it unknown and moved on, confident the loop would handle the rest. I wasn't chosen because I was special. I was chosen because I was consistent. A man who would keep digging, who would believe in procedure, who would follow evidence even when it bent back toward him. The ritual didn't need a victim who would run. It needed one who would arrive on time, flash a badge, and accept the role without being told. I closed the file knowing the truth had finally settled. This wasn't a case I'd inherited. It was one I'd been wearing since the day I signed up. They started slipping in when I wasn't looking for them. Not dreams, not flashbacks, something quieter. I'd be driving and know a street name before seeing the sign. I'd reach for a light switch in rooms I'd never been in and find it exactly where my hand expected. Familiarity without memory. Like muscle reflex borrowed from someone else's life. The worst ones came with emotion attached. Nostalgia for places I didn't grow up in. Regret for choices I didn't remember making. I felt anger toward people I'd never met. Then watched it fade before I could justify it. These weren't hallucinations. They had weight, texture, context. I found myself humming songs from the 80s, lyrics intact, verses I'd never learned. When I caught my reflection in a dark window, there were moments it felt delayed, like it needed time to decide which version of me to display. The memories didn't announce themselves. They behaved like reminders, as if I'd asked for them earlier and forgotten. Each one carried the same undertone: certainty, a calm confidence that bordered on arrogance. Whoever these memories belonged to had believed they were right. I understood then why awareness was dangerous. If I let these fragments settle, let them arrange themselves into a narrative, they wouldn't feel foreign anymore. They'd feel earned. And that scared me more than the idea of dying, because it meant part of me had already lived this once and decided it was worth repeating. The memories sharpened once I stopped resisting them. They lined themselves up, patient, waiting for permission. I saw rooms lit by neon and bad ideas, men talking too fast, convinced speed was the same thing as progress. I heard my own voice among them, younger, steadier, carrying the calm of someone who believed he could outthink entropy. That version of me didn't call it murder, he called it preservation. Miami, in his mind, was perfect only once. A narrow window where excess hadn't collapsed into parody, where danger still felt glamorous, where the city moved like it had something to prove. He saw the future coming, corporate, sanitized, apologetic, and decided it was a kind of death. So he designed around it. The ritual wasn't emotional, it was architectural. Timelines treated like load-bearing walls, lives positioned like supports, 6 points of pressure to hold an era in place whenever time tried to move on. The blade, the dates, the locations, nothing symbolic, everything functional. What terrified me wasn't the cruelty of it. It was how reasonable it felt from inside his head. He believed decay was honest. Change was betrayal. And if people had to die to keep the city true to itself, then that was simply the cost of good design. I felt the satisfaction in those memories, the pride of a system that worked, a loop that closed cleanly. That was when I understood the real danger. The architect hadn't been insane. He'd been convinced. And conviction, once it takes hold, doesn't ask permission to come back. Once I saw it that way, I couldn't unsee it. The killings weren't acts of violence. They were load tests. Each death measured stress, redistributed weight, confirmed that the structure still held. Bodies weren't taken out of anger or need, but placed with intention, like beams slotted into a frame no one else could perceive. The beach wasn't a crime scene, it was a foundation. That was why the positions mattered, why the timing had to be precise, why the weapon erased itself. You don't leave debris when you're building something meant to endure. Evidence would only invite questions, and questions create instability. I thought about how often we praise architecture for disappearing into function. A bridge that feels inevitable. A building you stop noticing once it works. That was the goal here, to make the ritual invisible. Seamless. Accepted as background noise in a city already numb to death. I understood then why the loop had survived so long. It was elegant, and elegance is persuasive. It convinces people not to look too closely. Even now, knowing what I knew, I felt the pull of it, the temptation to see the murders as necessary, even merciful. A few lives traded to keep an entire era intact. That was the final line I couldn't cross. If I accepted the design, I'd become part of it again. Not as an investigator, not as a victim, but as a supporting structure. I stepped back from the blueprints forming in my head, heart pounding, and made a choice the architect never had. I refused to admire the work. Awareness didn't arrive like an epiphany. It settled in slowly, like dust you only notice once it's everywhere. I could feel the shape of what was supposed to happen next, pressing in around me. The final alignment, the last body, the clean closure of the loop. The script was familiar in a way that made my hands tremble. I was meant to return to the beach alone, meant to bring the blade, meant to understand why it had to be done, and accept it as inevitable. Every prior version of me had reached that point and mistaken clarity for consent. This time, I hesitated. That pause was enough to break the rhythm. The city reacted immediately. Sirens overlapped wrong. Traffic lights stalled between colors. For a moment, Miami felt like it was holding its breath, waiting to see if I would behave. I thought about how often we confuse purpose with obligation, how easy it is to follow a path just because it's already worn into the ground. The memories urged me forward, calm and reassuring, promising relief if I just finished what I'd started decades ago. Instead, I stayed where I was. The headache flared, sharp as punishment. Something inside the city recoiled, like a mechanism grinding against resistance. I realized then how fragile the loop actually was. It didn't survive on force. It survived on cooperation, by refusing to move, by choosing not to arrive where I was expected. I did something none of the other versions had done. I broke character. And for the first time since 1985, the script didn't know how to proceed. I found the blade where I knew it would be, because I had put it there once before, wrapped in oilcloth, hidden beneath warped floorboards in a storage unit that no longer officially existed. It felt lighter than I expected when I picked it up, translucent at the edges, catching the light like frozen sugar. For a moment, my hand knew exactly how to hold it. That scared me. The blade vibrated faintly, reacting to my pulse, as if it recognized me. I understood then that it wasn't just a tool. It was a key, solid only long enough to do its work, designed to disappear into whoever completed the ritual. Into me. The memories urged precision, one clean motion, no hesitation, a perfect end. I did the opposite. I slammed the blade down against the concrete floor. It resisted, flexing instead of breaking, the surface rippling like liquid glass. Pain shot up my arm as chemicals burned through my skin, the toxin already trying to finish the job from the inside. I screamed and struck again. The third impact shattered it. The sound wasn't loud. It was wrong. Like ice snapping inside a skull. The fragments dissolved instantly, flooding my bloodstream, my vision exploding into white. For a heartbeat, I felt every version of myself at once, each one completing the ritual, each one dying on schedule. Then the rhythm collapsed. Time lurched. The pressure vanished. Somewhere deep in the city, something fundamental gave way. I didn't die. I didn't finish the cycle. I destroyed the only object that knew how to end it, and Miami began to come apart at the seams. The city reacted like a body in shock, not all at once, first in small, deniable ways. Streetlights flickered between sodium orange and LED white. Storefronts shifted names mid-glance, old lettering bleeding through new glass. I watched a man in a linen suit step out of a bar that hadn't existed for 30 years and disappear when a bus passed in front of him. Time didn't break. It overlapped. Sirens echoed from different decades, harmonizing where they shouldn't. A hotel I knew as condemned stood fully lit, then hollowed out again as I watched. People moved through the changes without stopping, their brains editing reality on the fly to avoid panic. The human mind is generous that way. I staggered through streets that refused to settle, feeling pulled in opposing directions. Memories that weren't mine surged and receded, no longer arranged in sequence. Past and present pressed together until the boundary dissolved. The pain in my veins flared, then steadied. The poison didn't kill me. It anchored me, holding me in the space where the timelines met. I understood then what I'd done. By destroying the blade, I hadn't ended the ritual. I'd removed its release valve. Miami Beach became a city without a dominant year. Every era bleeding through whenever it wanted. Not a loop, not a cycle. A permanent collision. And standing there, in the middle of it, watching decades fold over each other like bad film edits, I realized the cost hadn't been avoided. It had only changed shape. Weeks passed, or something like weeks. Time had become suggestive rather than authoritative. Miami Beach learned how to stutter. Buildings shimmered at the edges, their outlines refusing to commit. A renovated hotel would shed its glass skin for a second, revealing neon trim and cracked concrete beneath, then seal itself back up like nothing had happened. People adapted faster than I expected. They always do. Tourists laughed when strangers vanished mid-step, convinced it was performance art. Locals avoided certain intersections without being able to explain why. Children pointed at things adults refused to acknowledge, men who flickered like bad reception, cars that drove through red lights that weren't there anymore. I walked through it all feeling partially untethered, like my feet didn't fully agree on which year they belonged to. The poison still burned quietly in my blood, a reminder of where I was anchored. I could see the seams others couldn't. Feel when the city switched layers. At night, the flickering got worse. Music bled through walls from clubs long closed. Old radio ads whispered between stations. The air smelled different block to block, fresh paint giving way to cigarette smoke and salt-stained fabric. Miami didn't collapse. It learned how to glitch, and in that unstable equilibrium, I realized the city wasn't trying to heal itself anymore. It was learning how to live with the damage. They came anyway. Of course they did. Miami has never needed stability to sell itself. The guides changed their language first, swapping certainty for suggestion. You might see something unusual, brochures warned, as if the city were an attraction with optional features. Tourists posed with things they didn't fully understand. A couple smiled for a photo, while a man in shoulder pads and mirrored sunglasses drifted behind them, half-transparent, locked in a decade that refused to let him go. No one noticed until the picture developed wrong, faces sharp, background smeared with something older. Souvenir shops leaned into it. Retro shirts aged themselves overnight. Bars claimed to serve drinks from authentic timelines. People drank beneath flickering lights and convinced themselves they were chasing nostalgia, not standing in it. I watched from a distance as the city monetized the overlap. Fear diluted into novelty. Confusion repackaged as experience. It was easier that way. Easier than admitting the ground beneath them had stopped agreeing on what year it was. The echoes didn't interact much. They repeated their loops. Walking old routes, living fragments of lives that never reached conclusion. Some tourists waved at them. A few waved back. Smiles automatic, eyes unfocused. The city didn't correct the misunderstanding. It encouraged it, if time was going to bleed. Miami would find a way to sell the tickets. Stability never came back. Not gradually. Not quietly. The city stopped waiting for it. After a while, no one filed reports about flickers unless someone got hurt. The overlap became background radiation, unseen, but always there, altering behavior in small, permanent ways. Buildings learned their preferences. Some streets leaned heavily into the past, neon signs buzzing with authority. Sidewalks cracked in familiar patterns. Others insisted on the present. Glass and steel snapping back into place whenever an older version tried to surface. At the borders between them, reality frayed. People avoided those seams instinctively, crossing the street without knowing why. I stopped expecting resolution. There would be no final correction, no moment where time apologized and sorted itself out. Whatever balance existed now was improvised, held together by habit and denial. Miami wasn't healing. It had stabilized around being unstable. I felt it in my own body. The poison no longer burned. It settled. A constant hum, anchoring me to the interference pattern between years. I aged unevenly. Some days I felt older than I was allowed to be. Other days I felt like I hadn't moved forward at all. The city kept functioning. That was the most unsettling part. Life continued, not because the damage was fixed, but because everyone learned how to live inside it. Instability, I realized, isn't temporary when it's useful. It becomes infrastructure. And Miami had always been good at building on compromised ground. I felt them before I saw them. A pressure change, like the moment before an elevator stops too abruptly. The flickering around me tightened, snapping into cleaner lines, as if reality itself had been told to stand at attention. That was when I knew something new had entered the city. They didn't arrive loudly. No lights in the sky, no cracks in the ground. They stepped out of places that had always been there. Parking garages, service corridors, the dead space between buildings, and suddenly occupied them correctly, like pieces returning to a puzzle that had been wrong for too long. They looked like me. Not exactly. Cleaner. More deliberate. The kind of men who moved like they already knew the outcome. Each one wore the same expression I'd seen in the memories. Calm certainty. Untouched by doubt. When they spoke, they didn't introduce themselves. They didn't need to. "This deviation has exceeded tolerance," one of them said. His voice matched mine closely enough to make my skin crawl. "Correction is required." They weren't here to negotiate. Miami wasn't the patient. It was the symptom. I was the variable. Cell that refused to resolve. I asked how many of them there were. "All remaining," he replied. That was when I understood the scale of what I'd broken. The loop hadn't just failed. It had alerted something that existed outside the city. Outside time, as I understood it. An agency built from discarded outcomes, staffed by versions of me that had chosen differently and survived long enough to enforce it. They raised their weapons, not blades, not guns, but devices that hummed with erasure. The correction had arrived, and it had my face. They showed me what would happen if they finished the correction, not as a threat, but as documentation. Miami collapsing inward. Timelines compressing until the overlap became a singularity. Time folding into itself like paper forced through a pinhole. A clean solution. No city, no witnesses, no ghosts. "It's already unstable," one of them said. My voice without the hesitation. "You made it honest, but honesty doesn't prevent collapse." I believed them. That was the cruel part. The correction wasn't wrong. It was efficient. Erasing the anomaly meant erasing me. Every iteration, every deviation, every version that had ever interfered with the loop. A full rollback, with no residue left behind to reopen the wound. I asked why they hadn't done it already. Because consent improves containment, another version replied. That was when I realized they weren't executioners. They were caretakers of a broken system, tired of cleaning up after it. Killing me would work. Letting me choose would work better. The other Ricos stood there, waiting. Each of them carried the same history up to a certain point, then diverged. Some had completed the ritual. Some had tried to stop it and failed. All of them understood the cost of continuing. If we stepped forward together, the city would survive, unstable, flickering, but intact. If we refused, Miami would eventually tear itself apart. I felt something like relief, for the first time. The decision wasn't written ahead of me. No script, no architecture. Just a choice that would remove the need for choices ever again. I nodded. Around me, every version of Rico Vega did the same. Erasure wasn't darkness. It was subtraction. One moment I was stepping forward with the others, feeling the weight of every version of myself align. And the next, there was less of me than there should have been. Not pain, not fear, just absence spreading outward. Clean and precise. Miami didn't notice when I vanished. The city never does. It kept flickering, kept selling its contradictions, kept breathing through damaged lungs. The correction worked. The singularity never formed. The timelines loosened, no longer anchored to a man who refused to stay in one place. But nothing ever disappears completely. I exist now in the margins, in the pause between traffic lights, in the second before a reflection settles. People feel me more than they see me. A chill on the beach at low tide. A sense of being watched that fades the moment they turn around. Sometimes, someone about to step where they shouldn't hesitates for no reason. Sometimes a door jams just long enough to prevent a death that would have echoed too loudly. They never know why. That's fine. I don't have a badge anymore, no name that fits in records, but I remember the patterns. I feel the strain when the city pulls too hard against itself. And when it does, I'm there, stretched thin between seconds, doing what I always did best, watching the damage, keeping it from getting worse. Miami Beach remains unstable, honestly unstable, and somewhere in the spaces, time forgot to seal shut. The ghost of a detective keeps walking his beat, making sure the city never convinces itself that the lie was worth believing again.